On today's episode, we continue the countdown to the best prospect pool in the NHL. We're going through teams 23 through 21. We got 3 Canadian teams all coming up on today's episode of Locked On NHL Prospect.
You are Locked On NHL Prospects, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hello, and welcome back to Locked On NHL Prospects, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. On this podcast, we break down everything prospects related for you 5 days a week, Monday to Friday. During the summertime, though, it's going to be 3 times a week. I'm Hadi and Sebastian, joined by Sebastian High, and we're going to be continuing our countdown of the best prospect pools in the NHL. We've got teams 23 through 21 in today's episode. We've got the Ottawa Senators, the Toronto Maple Leafs, and the Calgary Flames, all coming up in our next 3 segments. So we've got an all-Canadian lineup here from 23 to 21. Before we get into any of that, though, make sure to like and subscribe if you're watching on YouTube. Leave us a comment saying who you want us to talk about next. And if you're listening on your favorite podcasting platform, make sure to make us your first listen of the day. It's always very much appreciated. So we start with the Ottawa Senators here at 23, Sebastian. I think there's a pretty steep drop-off after this, though. There's a pretty big glut of teams from 27 and 23. I think we have a pretty clear bottom 3 in terms of prospect pools, but after that is pretty tight. So the sense for me here, for me, it's the goaltender that changes everything. But you're a lot closer to home there. You're from Ottawa, so talk us through a couple of these prospects here.
For sure. I mean, I live in Ottawa, though I grew up a Habs fan, so I have a bit of a different perspective on it. But there are some players here that I find really interesting. I think that Ridly Greig projects really nicely as a likely third line, but potentially middle 6 energy winger. He really brings the intensity. He has some underrated skill outside of Ottawa. I think it's a bit overrated in Ottawa among Sens fans, but I really like how he projects, and I think that he complements that the future core quite nicely. I think that him and Shane Pinto will work together quite well, and he's definitely one of my favorite players. I mean, obviously Pinto and Sanderson have graduated now, but apart from him, there are a couple other interesting names. I mean, I'll let you get into the goalies later, but Yegor Sokolov is a really fun, skilled, really big, hard-shooting winger who the Sens have been very patient with. They've been allowing him to just marinate in the AHL for longer than I would have expected them to, and maybe longer than even I would have had him marinating there, because I think that he's quite ready for a sheltered NHL role where he could add in some depth scoring. And I think that the Sens are really trying to enter now their contention window. Whether or not that is a successful strategy, we will see. But these are some players that I think will fit into that. Along the same lines, Tyler Boucher is going to jump to the AHL next season. And while I am still not of the belief that this is the caliber of player that you would expect from a 10th overall selection, I do think that he was a lot more effective in the OHL last season than he was given credit for, and at the World Junior Championship as well. He was injured a lot, especially like from December onwards. I don't know if he played more than like 4 games. Yeah. But when he was healthy, he was a great complement to Ottawa's top line. He played some excellent minutes with Luca Pinelli and with Vincenz Rohr, and was really building on his game in terms of being a net front presence, but also being a skilled player that makes space for his teammates. And I thought that he was using his toolkit a lot more effectively to facilitate play off puck for his line mates. And I thought that he really took some steps. Now, I think his projection is still quite similar to Ridly Greig, where it's like third line and maybe more if you're lucky and if he continues taking steps. But I think the really big thing with Boucher is he needs to stay healthy. And one of the things with our ranking here is I think we're ranking Ottawa maybe a bit higher based off of like the idea of all prospects staying healthy, but with Boucher, there really is a big question mark on whether or not he can. So take into account some variance in our rankings as a result of that. Beyond that, there are some interesting names like Robbie Yarventia and Zack Ostapchuk is quite fun. And again, we're looking at more players that add intensity. Yarventia is a pretty decent goal scorer. Ostapchuk I've liked a lot in most of my recent viewings. Don't see any top 6 potential there, but he's fun and interesting. Same thing with Jacob Bernard Dogger. I thought that he's progressed quite well year to year. He plays a relatively subtle style of play, but I think that he could be number 4, number 5 for Ottawa moving forward. Similar thing for Lassie Thompson. So there's a lot of names here that I think could be good middle of the lineup potentially players, but the star caliber ones are already in the NHL, right? Like you already have the Sandersons, the Shabots, the Stutzlas, the Kachucks, so on and so forth. They're all already playing. But within the prospect pool, I mean, I'm sure you'll have some names to add to the mix here, but I like the fact that there's a decent amount of depth in different positions. And I also think that it is, for better or for worse, the prospect pool is very much built for a specific vision of a team where intensity is really, really valued, as is physicality. And we'll see how it pans out. But as far as that strategy goes, I think they could have done far, far worse than they've done so far.
Absolutely. There's a couple more names that I would like to talk about. I think that Thomas Hamara's struggle to adapt to junior hockey in North America will come to an end eventually. And I feel like the time that he spent playing overseas against professional competition and even his international tournaments were really solid. I feel like it's just a matter of time before he adapts to North American ice and we see a very different Thomas Hamara than we've seen in the OHL. Other than him, Donovan Sembrango is pretty interesting at defense. Tyler Clavin we haven't talked about, but I'm not the highest on him.
He's very physical. He definitely fits the Ottawa mold.
Exactly.
Sabrango was a good acquisition. That like he was a piece in the DeBrincat return where he was very, very much surplus of requirements in Detroit with their left defense pipeline. But I've really liked what I've seen from him. I don't think there's the highest of upside there, but in my mind, he projects as a really solid number 5 defenseman, and I think he could play NHL minutes within the next year or two. So I thought that was a nice little addition too.
For sure. Speaking of nice additions for a team that didn't have a pick, I think in the top 3 rounds last year, having added Hoyt Stanley is really not bad at all. It's a decent piece of work.
It's very not Ottawa though. Like it surprised me as a pick because this is a super raw BCHL player, and they usually go for their for the exact antithesis of that, of big, strong, college, massive, raw not being the word you use to describe them. But I think Hoyt Stanley was an awesome addition.
Absolutely. So that wraps things up for Ottawa. Now we're going to move on to the second team.
The goalies. The goalies, Hadi.
Right. Absolutely.
Your favorite
Let's go
segment?
to the goalies. For sure. I did want to mention Mads Søgaard and Levi Meriläinen, who for me make the difference and place him at 23. Mads Søgaard for me is one of the best goaltender prospects in the NHL. I really like the combination of size, athleticism, technicality. I think he's going to be a very, very good goaltender, and it'll take him a bit of time. I think 3-4 years before we see a fully peaked Mads Søgaard, but just the ability to go post to post, to cover his crease really well. The combination of knowing when to get aggressive on shooters and when to sit back and let his size do the work, I think is really interesting. And Meriläinen for me is definitely the type of player you could play as a backup to Mads Søgaard and will do a decent job, maybe play 15-20 games in the crease and do a good job of it. So those are two guys I think complement each other fairly well, and that could be a very good 1-2 punch in net for Ottawa long term, especially with all the stars they've added recently to their lineup, the Kachucks, the Stutzlas, the DeBrincats that they had recently, Claude Giroux, those type of players. They're guys you can plug in your lineup. I mean, obviously DeBrincat's gone now, but they've still got, I think they have 6 stars in their lineup right now based on a lot of model and production. So very stacked team with some decent but not overwhelming talent coming up. But we're going to be talking about the Toronto Maple Leafs in our second segment. But first and foremost, Sebastian, talk to us about our sponsor for today's episode.
Our next partner is AG1, the daily foundation nutrition supplement that supports whole body health. I gave AG1 a try, and now every morning before I drink my cup of coffee when I'm out perched on my front porch, I also take some AG1, and it really helps me feel energized and ready to take on the next day. I'm always after some new ways of healthily gaining some more energy, and AG1 works pretty well for me. If a comprehensive solution is what you are after, then try AG1 and get a free 1-year supply of vitamin D and 5 free AG1 travel packs with your first purchase. go to drinkag1.com/NHL Network to check it out. That is drinkag1/NHL Network. Go check it out.
Alrighty, so moving on to our second segment, we're going to be talking about the Toronto Maple Leafs, the team that tries every year to contend, to build a team that is going to go deep in the playoffs. Rarely does, unfortunately, but I did want to talk about their prospect pool and the guys they've added in recent years. I think a decent addition from last year was Easton Cowan. I think he did a great job with what he was given in terms of ice time in London, and I definitely liked Denver Barkey a bit more in terms of what he brought to the game. But they're very similar players. They called them the Twins last year based on the fact that they played very, very similar games and even look alike on the ice. Are about the same size, about the same intensity, same skating stride, all that stuff. So what's your kind of look on that addition specifically to get us started here?
The Easton Cowan pick was probably one of the only picks in the draft that brought me so much joy, despite it not being a pick that I personally would have made in that slot.
Yeah.
Easton Cowan's probably the hardest working player in the entire OHL. Tremendous motor. He's a really underrated playmaker. He really developed his one-touch playmaking game, especially, and he's really adept in small ice scenarios. Despite the skating not being the strongest, he's really adaptable and fairly agile, and along with the intensity, he brings in that playmaking game. And defensively, I think the reads definitely need some work. He's not exactly refined on that front, but he has the effort level, and I really do believe that he will become a plus level defensive player if he hits the NHL in an impactful role. So I really liked the addition for Toronto, even though I thought it was a bit of a reach in terms of pure upside. But it's quite clear to me that they drafted Easton Cowan to fill the Zach Hyman, Michael Bunting role on the first line, because he's exactly that type of player. He's really intelligent. He knows how to elevate really high end players. He can match their He can do all the dirty work for them, and while he can't really match their processing speed, he's quite good at anticipating what high-end players will do. So I think that will serve him well in those types of situations. Now, I don't think he's the best prospect in the pool, but I do think he was a nice little addition that the Leafs made at the draft.
Absolutely. And for me, the best prospect in the Leafs pool, I think, is a tie, personally, between Matthew Knies and Topi Niemela. I think both of those two are very, very impressive and show a lot of promise in what they're able to do. I think that Knies is certainly closer to the NHL. He's already played a couple games and looked really, really good on that lineup. The intensity, the effort level, the intelligence, the off-puck awareness, there are so many areas to his game that are developed enough that you could see him complement a top player like a William Nylander, like a John Tavares, potentially even Austin Matthews and Mitch Marner down the line. Very well with the ability, especially defensively, to get involved off the puck, to clog up lanes, to put a stick in the right lanes, to just outwork and outmuscle a lot of players, even at the NHL level. It's been fairly interesting to watch. And in Topi Niemela, I feel like you're getting a lot more finesse than Matthew Knies. Niemela is a very good right-handed defenseman, the type of guy who's able to connect plays really well. Who's able to move off the puck especially well when coming out of passes. So he likes to pass and move into lanes, which is something I really look for in defensemen. Likes to occupy space in the offensive zone, likes to activate. He's worked a lot on his offensive game just by pure nature of just facing those scenarios more often, because he got more daring. And as he got more daring, instead of facing maybe, 4 or 5 offensive scenarios per game, he started facing 20, 25, 30. And that helps the defenseman so much when it comes to developing their offensive game. Because the main issue, even with forwards developing areas of their game, you want to see that player explore that area of their game. If they're not going to get a lot of opportunities to get those looks. And I feel like Niemela worked with the Leafs staff in order to develop those areas of his game and make him a very good off-puck mover, a very good offensive activator, and he's become a lot better at making plays through pressure, making plays from the offensive blue line. It's just gotten a lot better for him, and I'm excited to see what he gives at the next level. Other than that, there's a couple names that I find very, very interesting. First and foremost for me is Dmitry Ovchinnikov. He signed his contract, he's playing the AHL, and he's just a water bug out there. Very quick, elusive skater, a lot of intensity. He's got great hands as well. He's been one of those guys that I kind of saw as a gem early on in his career. in his draft year. He was one of those guys that a lot of guys had in the public sphere, maybe in the second or third round because they liked them a lot. He ended up going in the 6th round to the Leafs. So one of those guys to keep a look on for sure. Veeti Miettinen had amazing production in his draft year in Finland and got drafted on the late and about in the 4th round by the Leafs and has produced decently well for St. Cloud State in the NCAA. There are guys I've kind of grown away from, like Semyon Dargachintsev, who we call SDA for ease purposes. He's kind of stagnated, and I don't think he's going to become anything at this point. But Fraser Minton last year was a great addition as well. Very responsible, but also underrated playmaking, a bit like Easton Cowan.
Yeah.
And especially Ty Voigt is just breaking a lot of records in the OHL right now with his production. Just an amazing playmaker. I believe he led the entire league in assists as a 19, 20-year-old. So really not bad for that kind of bunch. I like their depth at center. And we haven't even mentioned Rodion Amirov, who I haven't watched in a while. So I'll let you kind of pick up from here.
Yeah, I mean, with Amirov, there's obviously the big asterisk of, I mean, he had cancer, right? And that completely changes any normal development curve. I thought he was an excellent pick in his draft year. He was picked 15th overall, and I thought it was a great value selection in terms of the skill and the finesse and the upside. I thought it was a great swing on that upside. Yeah. Now, I don't think it's as likely to hit it anymore, and it's entirely for factors outside of his own control. That said, I would very, very few things would bring me more joy in the NHL than seeing Rodion Amirov like hitting his original ceiling. So I really want to see it happen. I think I was able to catch one viewing of him last season, which was less than I wanted to, but he looked good in it. Like obviously, like there's still some shaking off of rust, but I've liked what I've seen from him, and I think that Nick Moldenhauer is another player that was a really good pickup for the Leafs last season. I don't think he has the highest of upsides, but he's really intelligent, quite responsible. I think he projects nicely as a 3rd or 4th line contributor who can really add in some depth scoring and some depth skill, which I think the Leafs could definitely use because they inevitably have injuries, and he's one of the types of players that could kind of just plug holes higher up in the lineup when need be, which especially the Leafs need with their tendency of having top 6 injuries.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of depth in different positions. We haven't even mentioned Ryan Ferberg. I think that the defense depth and the goaltending depth holds Toronto back a bit. Other than Topi Niemela and William Villeneuve, I don't see really many defensemen in their prospect pool that could become NHLers, and especially there's a lack of goaltending depth, which is the main thing that the Leafs need the most for me. I mean, they need someone who's going to be able to win them games on their own, and that's a goaltender 90% of the time.
Yeah.
So that's kind of the next thing I'd be looking at if I were the Leafs. But that wraps things up for the Toronto Maple Leafs and our breakdown of their prospect pool. Now we're going to get into the Calgary Flames and their pool right after these messages on this episode of Locked On NHL Prospects. Alrighty, so moving on to our final segment, which is team number 21 in our countdown to the best prospect pool in the NHL. We've got the Calgary Flames. They just slightly edge out the Leafs and Sens for me based on who they've added this year. I really, really like the addition of Samuel Honzek. I think it's a fantastic. It's a great fit. I was sure they were going to go for Matthew Wood, but I believe he went just before to the Nashville Predators.
Yeah, one pick earlier, I think. 15 and 16.
Exactly. So having them pick up Samuel Honzek as what people would consider a consolation prize. I mean, for me, I think Honzek is a better player than Matthew Wood. So that works out for the best, in my opinion. Honzek is he's a big towering center with a fantastically long reach, and he's able to get involved. Yeah.
Or left wing. He's played a bit of both. I'm not fully sold on him down the middle just yet, but are you?
Yeah.
I'm curious about
personally convinced at the center position. It's not just the reach and the ability to get involved in the middle of the ice. It's just, for me, there are little habits, especially when he's helping out his defenseman in the defensive zone. His tendency to swing low, even as a winger, he would occupy that F1 position and swing low on his defenseman to give them an option to break out. He's very much aware of the trouble that's going on around him, which is one thing I'm looking at mainly for my centers, which is another thing that made me kind of convinced that Otto Stenberg could play a center role as well, which not everyone's convinced of either. But yeah, that's the main thing I look for in Honzek's game. Is just he's responsible defensively to a level where I'm pretty convinced. I understand that the size and lack of proper kind of foot speed turns people off as a center, but for me, a center is more than just a puck carrier. I think that you can have a puck carrying winger without a problem. I feel like Honzek as a connector is really good, and I feel like his off puck movement, offensively and defensively, is solid enough that I'd be fairly convinced that he could do a good job at center.
Nice. Yeah. I mean, I love Samuel Honzek as well. I thought that he was just a tremendous pick in that range, but also for Calgary specifically. I think I had him ranked like 16th, 17th in that range as well.
Yeah.
And I'm a really big fan of how he plays. He's super toolsy. This is a player, like one of the rare players that you're going to find in the teens of the NHL draft who has a combination of a pretty high upside and pretty high floor. I think that you're getting a pretty much guaranteed top 9 player here. It really showed last season that he had professional experience playing in a junior league, and he was probably the best puck protector in the entire draft class. Tremendous physical tools. I think his shot is really underrated.
It's absurd. Yeah,
he can really get it off from medium range, and I think the playmaking is also real strength. He's a true dual threat with significantly good handling ability too. Yep. He's incredibly well rounded, but I mean that in a really impactful way rather than like a boring. You can do a bit of everything.
Like, he's not a jack of all trades, master of none. He's really, I mean, he's a
master. He's a master of a few, and he's pretty much very good at everything else, which is what you love to see. And I think that he could also be molded into a variety of different roles by the Calgary development staff, which I'm sure is part of the reason that they drafted him. But I find it kind of funny that like really like their 4 best skater prospects are all technically left wings. Yep. And I'm a little bit concerned by maybe just how much they're stacked in that one position. Like obviously wingers are rather interchangeable, and guys like Jakob Pelletier and Matthew Coronato, Samuel Honzek, and Adar Suniev, who's fun and we'll get into in a moment. Yep. I think those are all players that can play both sides and be relatively effective, but the lack of center depth is a bit concerning, and Connor Zary has had a lot of injury problems, and I'm not quite sure how he projects anymore at this point, but I haven't watched too much of him. So have you gotten an eye on him a couple times?
I'm sorry, it's been a while since I've watched him, but I was just going to say that's exactly what makes me think that they might want to develop Samuel Honzek as a center.
For sure.
And that's
they have all the incentive to do so. Yeah.
Exactly. And, you know, with guys in their system like Pelletier, like Coronato, like Adar Suniev, we mentioned earlier, William Strongbrand as well. They've got a lot of guys who are going to be playing that position. They've got a decent amount of depth on that side. I think that it's just a matter of time before we see Samuel Honzek either play at center at the junior level or get traded to a team that's going to play him at center, because I think the Flames are intent on having him play that position, which is fully understandable. For me, the issue with Calgary specifically and why they're kept out of the top end is, first and foremost, I don't see anyone who I can be fully convinced will play a top line role in their pool. Second of all, it's a lack of depth at right wing and at right defense, and just defense in general. They added Etienne Morin, who I'm not convinced about. They've added Jeremy Poirier, who I'm equally not as convinced about, and Jan Kuznetsov as well. I mean, for me, the difference maker for them is that big prospect in goal, in Dustin Wolf. But before, talk us through Adar Suniev, because I know you're a big fan.
Oh, he's fun. I've really enjoyed watching Penticton last season, and Adar Suniev is one of the most wacky prospects that was eligible in 2023. He was the worst skater in the entire draft class by a fair margin. It was him and Matthew Wood were the clear 2 worst skaters in my view. Really bad strides, super wide. That said, he's really intense and he applies pressure, and he's going to need to improve the skating to be able to apply the same level of pressure against pro competition, but he's going to have time. Like, he's going to have to marinate for like 4 years at least before he challenges for an NHL spot. But this is a really intense player with a very hard shot. He's a really strong goal scorer, and he's quite defensively responsible. So I think that the skating is really the one massive limiting factor that needs to be addressed. But if you can stick him next to a really high-end skating coach for a couple years, I think you're going to see some really, really big steps for him. And And then before we go to Dustin Wolf, we have to talk about the last two high-end forward prospects in Jakob Pelletier and Matthew Coronato. So
Yeah.
Do you have a favorite of those two?
Definitely Coronato.
Yeah.
I like Pelletier. I just see him more as a projectable kind of third line scoring winger rather than a full on top six talent. I think Coronato has the effort level, the smarts, and the goal scoring ability in order to become a true second line and borderline complementary first line player. I'm not convinced of the first line potential fully. I think it's possible, but it'll take a lot of stars aligning, whereas the second line upside is fairly easy to see. So that's kind of my take on those two. I don't know if you prefer Pelletier, but no. I think
it's a big gap in my mind too. Like,
yeah,
I think Coronato has a really decent likelihood of being a top six player that can really move the needle. Yeah. And Pelletier, I've tried a lot because the AHL production is really impressive, and it has been consistently. Yeah. But whenever I've watched him play, I've been seeing a player who, yes, has some really, really interesting tools and abilities, but in terms of that tangible NHL upside, I'm a little bit more skeptical on his front than I am on Coronato's, who I've been a really big fan of going back to his draft year.
Absolutely. And to finish things off for the Flames, we left the best for last in Dustin Wolf. For me, after Devin Levi, this is the best goaltending prospect in the NHL.
Jesper Wallstedt? Wow.
I like Jesper Wallstedt, but
wow.
I'm more convinced of Dustin Wolf's potential, and maybe it's my favoritism for short kings, but
possibly.
I very, very much see the upside in Dustin Wolf's game. He's perfectly tailored his game to his lack of size. Reminds me a lot of UC Saros, and so does Devin Levi. Just in terms of the way that they play, working perfectly with them being smaller, more athletic, more mobile players.
I concur.
He's very much. I mean, I love Jesper Wallstedt. I love Yaroslav Askarov. I love Spencer Knight. Those guys are kind of usually the guys you see mentioned when talking about the best goaltending prospect in the NHL. Yeah, but for me, Dustin Wolf is he's a perfect example of why you should scout goaltenders with guys who know how to scout short goaltenders, because a lot of these guys slip in rankings just because they're small, and you'll see a lot of teams pick up some 6'6", 6'7" goaltenders who don't have the athletic ability, don't have the puck tracking or the play reading or the hockey sense that a guy like Wolf or Levi has. I mean, for me, Dustin Wolf has everything you want in order to make the NHL and become a very, very solid puck stopper. It's just a matter of, will the team trust him enough in order to see him play those scenarios, and will he be able to force their hand if he doesn't, if they don't, essentially. And that's kind of the question with me with Wolf, but I'm convinced. I'm personally sold. So
I am too. I still have Wallstedt kind of a tier above. I believe in the toolkit a bit too much.
Yeah.
But to me, it's a quite clear top 3 and top 4 in terms of goalie prospects in the league. And I think it's Wallstedt, Levi, and Dustin Wolf. And then I think Askarov has a firm hold on the 4th spot in my view. But yeah, this is a tremendous prospect and definitely a big difference. So I definitely do think that there's a bit of a gap between Ottawa and then Toronto and Calgary, as we've kind of broken down those prospect pools. I see some more upside in Calgary and Toronto. I think that Matthew Knies and Coronato and Honzek and Wolf are significantly ahead of Ottawa, which is kind of indicative of that big gap that we have between 23 and 22.
Absolutely. So that wraps things up for our episode today. Thank you very much for tuning in. If you're listening on your favorite podcasting platform, make sure to make us your first listen of the day. If you're watching on YouTube, make sure to like and subscribe. Leave us a comment. It's always very much appreciated. For your second listen of the day, though, make sure to check out Locked On Sports Today. They have all your news about what's going on in the sports world. They'll keep you up to date on what's going on there. And stay tuned for our next episode where we officially start our top 20 prospect pools in the NHL. Is going to be very interesting. We'll get that for you fairly soon. In the meantime, I'm Hadi Kalakesh, joined by Sebastian Hai, and we'll see you next time.